Let's break down the top waiver wire ads moving into week 15 of the 2024 fantasy football season. We are heading into the fantasy playoffs. So here are a few players that may be able to help you guys push through into the next round of the fantasy playoffs here in the 2024 fantasy football season. And before we do so, let me remind you guys that Underdog is the place you want to be if you want to get in on additional fantasy football action all season long. Their Week 15 NFL Pick'ems are already going live, and all of their Monday night football Pick'ems for Week 14 are already live as well. And Underdog is giving all new users who sign up with promo code THECATCH a free NFL Pick'em to use towards this week's action. And on top of that, Underdog is also giving all new users who sign up with promo code THECATCH a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So it's a free NFL pick'em for the week on Underdog and up to $1,000 in bonus cash on Underdog when you sign up with promo code THECATCH. That link is down below. All right, let's kick the video off with Adam Thielen of the Carolina Panthers, who is sitting at 70% rostered. He'll be the highest rostered player on today's video, but man, oh man, he came through in week 14 with 19.2 fantasy points in a very tough matchup, 11 targets, 9 grabs, 102 receiving yards, and he now has 19.2 or more fantasy points in 2 straight games. Had that big game in week 13 against Tampa Bay Buccaneers as well. We look at the remaining strength of schedule for Adam Thielen. It is not bad, and I was a fan of going out and grabbing Adam Thielen in the past 2 weeks or so, but I was pretty worried about Thielen going into this matchup against the Philadelphia Eagles, as they have had 2 shutdown corners in that secondary. But for me, if Thielen can come through in this matchup against the Eagles on the road here, then these next 3 games, 2 of which are at home against Dallas and Arizona, and then the following game on the road against Tampa Bay in a great matchup, like Adam Thielen is a player who we can flex on a weekly basis and gives you a safe floor and has a good amount of upside, right? And this, Panthers offense that we've been talking about for the past couple weeks, they did not look bad at all. They really came out and they were neck and neck with that Eagles team all day long, and were a drop touchdown from Xavier Leggett away from potentially winning this game. I mean, this is a different Bryce Young, a different Panthers offense we've seen over the past couple of weeks, and Adam Thielen is at the front and center of that when it comes to the wide receiver position. He's getting the most targets on this team. He has the most touchdown upside, and he's going to continue to be a safe floor play as we wrap up the fantasy season. So if he's out there and available, I know he's pretty highly rostered, but if he is out there, he is a must-add waiver addition going into week 15. All right, next up, let's talk about Jalen McMillan of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, coming in at 12% rostered, coming off of a big game, 21.9 fantasy points against the Raiders, 7 targets, 4 grabs, 59 receiving yards, and 2 touchdowns. Now, of course, we want to be careful here. We don't want to chase this past week's points because every other game on the season outside of week 1, he's had under 10 fantasy points. And, in that stretch when Chris Godwin went down and Mike Evans was out for a bit, McMillan basically did nothing. But what you saw this past week was very promising. Now, it is worth noting Sterling Shepard had 10.3 fantasy points, 6 targets, 4 grabs, and 63 receiving yards. And then, of course, Mike Evans at the wide receiver position had 5 targets, 4 grabs, 69 receiving yards, and 10.9 fantasy points. And then, we've got Bucky Irving a bit banged up. Are we going to see more Rachaad White? Is he going to get that involvement in the passing game? Cade Otton also on this team, of course, 4 targets, 3 grabs this past week. So the pecking order here is a little bit unclear when it comes to the Buccaneers pass catchers outside of, I think you could argue that Mike Evans is the undisputed wide receiver 1. I think we all know that. But this past week, Jalen McMillan had the most targets out of any pass catcher on this team. It's a little bit of a tough matchup in week 15, going on the road against the Chargers, but that defense has been a little fluky in the past couple weeks. But then he gets 2 good enough matchups to wrap up the season. Week 16 on the road against Dallas, week 17 at home against the Panthers. Now, worth noting, the Panthers secondary has not been that bad the past couple of weeks, and they actually have not been that bad against wide receivers on the majority of the season. But if you're looking for a desperation play, you're in a deeper league, dealing with injuries, all that stuff. We had a ton of injuries pile up at the end of last week. You never know what type of circumstance you're going to find yourself in. But the good news is we got no teams on bye week this week. But Jalen McMillan may end up being a play for the remainder of the fantasy season. But I will say proceed with caution with this one. But what I do like about McMillan is the potential for this Bucs offense to really get on a roll here. They are now officially at the top of their division, even with 2 losses to the Falcons, and they look like the better football team compared to the Falcons. So they are going to be trying to do everything whatsoever as the season wraps up to secure that division and make it into the playoffs. So we may see a bigger push for a player like Jalen McMillan. And speaking of the Falcons, I want to take a look at Ray McCloud of the Atlanta Falcons, sitting at 24% rostered. He has quietly had double digits in 3 straight games, 10.6 points in Week 11, 13.3 in Week 13, 16.1 this past week against the Vikings, 11 targets, 8 grabs, 98 receiving yards, and he's got a pretty good strength of schedule to wrap up the season. Going on the road against the Raiders this week, not too bad. It's the Giants in a good matchup at home in Week 16. Then on the road against Commanders in Week 17, not the best, not the worst. So ultimately, this is not an awful strength of schedule to wrap up the season. Now, I do have some concerns with the Falcons' overall offense right now in terms of their passing offense, as we've seen 0 touchdowns out of Kirk Cousins, since Week 10 and 8 interceptions and quite a few fumbles in that range as well. And obviously, Darnell Mooney, Drake London, these are going to be your first and foremost pass catchers on this team. You're going to see a little bit of volume to Bijan Robinson, and who knows what's going to happen with Kyle Pitts, but he could always do something. But like I said, this has been a consistent pattern now for 3 weeks for Ray McCloud, and the Falcons, once again, still trying to fight for a spot in the playoffs here, although it's looking less and less promising as the weeks continue here. But nonetheless, they will be throwing the football quite a bit over the next couple of weeks. And Ray McCloud, if you are in a desperation area for a flex option, he can certainly provide that. We're looking at some names here that you want to proceed with caution with. And we got no teams on bye weeks this week and for the remainder of the season. So may not have to make these moves, but Ray McCloud could certainly be a desperation play if you absolutely need him. Speaking of desperation plays, let's take a look at Michael Wilson of the Arizona Cardinals, who sits at 15% roster. This is another player who's quietly had double digits in 2 straight weeks, 10.5 points in Week 13, 13.7 this past week, 2 catches off of 3 targets, 57 receiving yards, and a touchdown, and a decent strength of schedule to wrap up the season. Gets New England this week at home, then on the road at Carolina, and then on the road against the Rams. So certainly opportunity here for Michael Wilson. Now, there's another offense that I have some concerns about when it comes to the passing offense. We saw Kyler Murray struggle again a bit. Was fine, but also struggled through 2 interceptions, through 259 passing yards, 2 touchdowns. But it just hasn't really felt in sync when it comes to this Cardinals passing attack as of late. But it's a pretty good strength of schedule. Michael Wilson, always a gamble, but when we're looking at these kind of like gamble-esque players who might come through for you, get you double digits, he's been one of those guys throughout this season, and he has had 4 previous double-digit performances before Week 13 on the season as well. So once again, we're looking deep here. We're looking at desperation plays. No teams on bye weeks, but you never know what situation you're going to be in. We saw a lot of craziness at the end of Week 14. So if you are desperate, Michael Wilson sits at 15% rostered and could be a play in Week 15. All right, let's move along to the running back position, and let's kick things off with the Jets running backs. We got Braylon Allen at 68% rostered, and Isaiah Davis did come through in Week 14. He sits at 14% rostered. So Braylon Allen was also pretty solid, 12.1 fantasy points. Didn't see any touchdown upside, 43 yards on the ground, 5 targets, 4 grabs, 38 receiving yards. Isaiah Davis was not that bad on the ground, 4 yards per carry, 10 touches, 40 yards, a touchdown, 6 targets, 3 grabs, 27 receiving yards. So we basically saw an even split for these guys. And Isaiah Davis ended up being the one who punched a touchdown in. I was pretty high on Braylon Allen as a last-minute waiver addition going into Week 14 as a solid start. And I will say the game script really benefited both of these players in Week 14. And now we have the Jets officially eliminated from playoff contention. So I don't exactly know how that's going to affect things. And then we got the elephant in the room. Is Breece Hall going to play in Week 15? Because if he plays, well, then the value of both of these players would essentially go out the window. But I still believe there's a strong chance that Breece Hall is just done for the season. It would not surprise me at all, especially when the Jets have been eliminated from playoff contention. Why not see what you have in a young running back like Braylon Allen, or even potentially in a player like Isaiah Davis, also in his rookie season? I don't think you need to necessarily look for your next starting running back because you have that in Breece Hall, but Breece Hall also has a history of injuries, and in the NFL, the position that gets moved on from the quickest, or in the quickest sense, is the running back position. So I'm not saying Breece Hall's career with the Jets is over or anything like that, but you just never know, right? And at the end of the day, it's a great matchup on the road here against the Jacksonville Jaguars, who have been awful against the run on the entirety of the season. They have a good matchup in Week 16 against the Rams, and then a good matchup in Week 17 on the road against the Buffalo Bills. So if these are going to be our guys for the Jets for the remainder of the season, we want to go ahead and make sure that they are rostered on our respective teams. Now, the split could be really interesting here. This could be really frustrating. We might see better weeks out of Davis, better weeks out of Allen. It might make you a little bit frustrated as the season wraps up. And if you want to stay away from it, I don't blame you, especially not really knowing the status of Breece Hall. But if Breece Hall is done on the season, then we're going to see plenty of value out of Allen and Davis as we wrap up things here on the fantasy season due to these matchups. I am a little worried because Jets are out of the playoffs, right? But I think they're going to try and see what they've got on this team as they're trying to bring in a new head coach, right? Maybe bring in a new quarterback. Who knows what's going to happen with this Jets team, right? But bottom line, fantasy-wise, Allen, Davis get a great matchup in Week 15 and for the rest of the season, and both these guys could end up being valuable waiver additions going into Week 15. All right, next up, we got to talk about Tank Bigsby of the Jacksonville Jaguars, sitting at 49% roster, 13.2 fantasy points in Week 14 against Tennessee, 18 touches on the ground, 2 targets, a catch for 7 receiving yards, had 55 yards on the ground, and a touchdown. We compare that to Travis Etienne. He had just 4 touches. He did muster up 4 catches off of 4 targets for 50 receiving yards, so he also had double digits and 11 fantasy points, but Bigsby completely out-touched him. I don't know if I want to read too much into this, if it was like kind of game script oriented. Etienne had 16 total touches in Week 13. Bigsby had just 8 touches in Week 13, so kind of tough to evaluate here, but they've got a pretty good strength of schedule to wrap up the season. And this is another one of these teams, like, what are the Jaguars really playing for as we wrap up the remainder of the 2024 season? But they get the Jets in Week 15, the Raiders in Week 16, then Tennessee again in Week 17. So I think Bigsby is worth a shot if you're desperate for an additional running back on your roster. I've been pretty vocal about disliking the Jaguars running backs as the season has gone on here and wanting nothing to do with them. But once again, some of you guys might need some deep plays. It's playoff time. You might need one of these players in a desperation sense. So Tank Bigsby, do the matchup against the Jets at home in Week 15 is worth an addition going in to Week 15. All right, next up, let's talk about Sincere McCormick of the Las Vegas Raiders, who had 10.9 fantasy points in Week 14, 15 touches on the ground, 78 rushing yards, 3 targets, 2 grabs, and 11 receiving yards. And as the week went on, we liked Sincere McCormick as a desperation play. And this past week in Week 14, there were plenty of us who needed a desperation play as the week progressed there. So McCormick came through, right? 10.9 fantasy points. What more can you ask from a Raiders running back on a team where their backup quarterback, Aiden O'Connell, goes down and misses almost the whole game, and Desmond Ridder comes in, right? So listen, this once again is going to be contingent on Alexander Madison and Zamir White, but my theory is still that McCormick has earned touches. He's been arguably the most efficient running back that has gotten touches on this Raiders team all season long. He has 5.2 yards per carry or more, and each of the last 3 games with a ceiling of 6.6 yards per carry. He looks pretty good running the football. It's not the best matchup against the Falcons in Week 15, but then he gets Jacksonville and New Orleans. So I don't know how much Madison and White we're going to see as the season wraps up. Obviously, those guys could affect touches here, but I really think McCormick is going to get a shot to get plenty of touches as the season starts to wrap up here. And those 2 matchups in Week 16 and 17 make McCormick roster worthy just because he gets the Jags and the Saints. If he's a guy getting touches there, you never know what's going to happen between now and the end of the season. He could be a play for you guys. He sits at just 19% rostered. It's maybe a player who provides a solid floor as the fantasy season wraps up. And boy, oh boy, this is just a cursed season for the San Francisco 49ers. Yes, they had a dominant win against the Bears at home, which they very much needed. But in that win, Isaac Guerrero suffered a foot injury after he had 26.8 fantasy points. And he may miss this week. He may miss an additional week. He might play this week. Who knows what's going to happen here? But man, I mean, just another week, another Niners injury. That's the theme of the season for the 49ers. So who's the next man up? I guess it's Patrick Taylor, 7 touches, 25 yards on the ground, and a touchdown. Left him with 8.5 fantasy points. And to wrap up the season here, it's a decent strength of schedule as the Niners will get the Rams, the Dolphins, and a bit of a tough matchup against the Lions in the fantasy championship. But once again, I mean, this Niners offense, this Niners team showed some life this past week. That division is still somewhat open, although it looks pretty competitive between the Seahawks and the Rams. And who knows, maybe the Cardinals make a comeback. It's a very interesting division as the season wraps up. But hey, the Niners are not just going to roll over. They definitely showed that this past week. And if Patrick Taylor's the guy getting touches in this offense, then he is certainly worth a roster spot in fantasy football leagues. So pay attention as the week progresses here. Isaac Guerrero might be okay this week. He might miss this week. Still kind of up in the air as it is believed to be a foot sprain. So we don't exactly know how serious that's going to be. But if Patrick Taylor gets touches, then he's probably worth a desperation start at best. But keep in mind here, the Niners, might look to a practice squad player. They signed Izzy this past week, right? They might sign somebody else. They might elevate somebody. I mean, they're going to have to get some more depth on this roster at running back if Guerrero misses this week. Keyshawn Vaughn was elevated this past week over Izzy. So we'll see what happens here. But somebody's going to have some value on this Niners team in terms of a running back. And right now, Patrick Taylor looks to be the player if Guerrero misses time. And that'll do it for today's video. There are your top waiver wire additions moving into Week 15 of the 2024 fantasy football season. As always, guys, I'm answering as many fantasy football questions in the comment section down below as I can. So if you guys need anything moving into the first week of the fantasy playoffs, please drop me a comment. I'll get back to as many of you guys as I possibly can. More importantly, make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel because we're going to have every single thing you could possibly need on a daily basis to help you guys dominate each and every remaining week of the fantasy season as we start to progress through the fantasy playoffs. So make sure you guys are subscribed so that you don't miss out on any of the content. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.